Welcome to White Women Wake Up. I'm Jonelle.
And I'm Karen. Together, we're diving into real, unfiltered conversations about what it means to wake up as white women in a world shaped by bias, power dynamics, and inherited patterns. We're here to challenge norms, examine our assumptions, and foster empathy. Through raw intergenerational dialogue, it's not always easy, and we don't always agree, but we show up anyway.
We do show up, Karen.
Hey, Jonelle.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
How was were you able to do any reflection on last week's topic? It was on individualism.
Individualism, but it was about, so my question for us to tackle at the end was, okay, we're talking about people to think in like more of a community group mindset, less an individual. But I know the comment is going to come because it comes from people all the time, is like, I use the example of voting, that we need to vote for a community mindset. And people are going to argue, does that mean I should vote against my own interest? And I think the thing to that to really, and the example that I used was, okay, maybe it's raising taxes to pay for a playground in your local community, or it's raising taxes for a school and you don't have children, things like that, and you can't afford more taxes. And so this is where these things are tricky. When it comes down to these like really finite details, I'm not trying to have anyone vote against their interest or anything, but I do think it's still taking the time to look at what is better for the community overall. Because studies have shown time and time again that when you raise up a community, everyone in that community benefits one way or the other. And so, again, it's not still the right answer and it's tricky to say, but I would also tell people to kind of like reflect on what harm do they think, or like what voting against their interest means. And I don't know. It's a tricky statement.
Well, and I think that's why we're having these conversations. I mean, I know for me this last week, I just, and maybe this is letting myself off the hook, but I didn't realize that my individualism also could equate to where I was complicit. And so I tried to simplify it and not think in big terms, but think about it more in, okay, if my individual way of doing something is a white normative way of doing it, am I changing that perspective? Am I opening my perspective so that I can do things differently, so that I can see things differently, so that I can open my mind to how other people see things.
Yes.
And so I don't have a perfect example of that, but I think I'm just trying to figure out that balance between the healthy part of caring for myself but not maybe always centering myself. Maybe that's it. And Matt always, I like I said last week, I liked when you used the word center because it feels like, oh, I'm trying to make the focus all on me or my family, my world, or my biases. Can I open that up to look at how other people are entering into the story, entering into life?
Yeah. Well, and I think, so this kind of actually leads into my topic today. Something that I've been thinking about a lot a week, because the individualistic mindset, the capitalism mindset are all theories around it's a zero-sum game and stuff. And so that there's only so much, and we've talked about this with scarcity and kind of the colonial mindset, is like there's only so much of a pie. And if more people get that pie, then there's less for me, kind of thing. And it is actually, they've done these studies too on individuals like at a pizza party where some individuals will be freaked out that there won't be enough left for them, so they get 3 slices, where they've also done studies where opposite, people who feel like there won't be enough for everyone only take the 1 slice, kind of thing. And so these just different mindsets within when we think it's a zero-sum versus kind of an endless abundance situation. And so I want to talk about it in the terms, though, of reverse racism and reverse discrimination.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So
could you define reverse racism and reverse discrimination?
yes. So great. We'll get into that. So reverse racism technically is a term that has been put out there since about the 70s, they say, is when that term started to be coined. And there's no validity to what reverse racism is, because racism is around both discrimination and systematic power. And so racism comes from the white people who have the power majority in this country, and therefore racism only stems from the power majority. And so you can't have a reverse racism against white people because you don't have systematic power there. Now, discrimination, on the other hand, that's, I think, where people kind of mix the discrimination can happen to anyone.
Okay.
It can happen to individuals. It can happen to groups. It can happen to anyone. There's not necessarily a power play in that mix there. And so a lot of times
it can be in there, but it
can be in there, but it doesn't
it's not
have
part
to
of the
be.
definition.
You can still discriminate against someone based on all sorts of factors about them. And so I think this is kind of the where people talk about reverse racism, especially in this world where we feel like white people are now getting this plight of, everything's against us. I kind of want to talk about, the myths around reverse racism and discrimination.
And how does that play into zero-sum game?
I will explain that in a little bit. And so, but where this came from is earlier, just a couple weeks ago, the Supreme Court clarified they saw a case, and this is really scary, about an employer. It was a white woman in Ohio who filed a lawsuit based against discrimination with Title VIII, and so or Title VII. Now, Title VII says that you can't discriminate against characteristics in the workplace like sex and gender and sexual identity and age, all of those factors. And so in the past, though, if it had been what they call reverse discrimination, which is the majority held, so you're white, you're a man, you had to back it up with further context of why this is discrimination and why this isn't just an I feel case versus a factual case kind of thing.
Okay.
And stuff. So where this ruling was big is the Supreme Court now took that clause out and said that actually anyone qualifies under Title VII discrimination. So meaning if a white man
a white man feels discriminated
does
against.
not get the promotion, but a woman does, he can file discrimination clauses that he is now being abused against be discriminated based on his gender. And so the reason why this case, though, is really big is because it starts to dilute the purpose and the power, especially in this country. We're seeing country. So we're seeing DI being taken away. We're seeing all these things taken away. It now dilutes the intention of this, which to have safe holds for people with less power in this country, to have abilities to do that. And so anyway, so this is kind of where that stemmed from. And I just wanted us to kind of start talking about where we've seen reverse racism and also just kind of talk about the myths around all of this.
But you're talking about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm glad talk about a good conversation skill. Normally, if we were at the dining room table, I wouldn't have said, could you define that? And I would have just jumped in, right? Good lesson right there.
We are learning good things.
Because so let's go back and look at the thing. You're talking about zero-sum game. That was one thing. You're talking about reverse racism.
Well, zero-sum game comes in a little bit later. Okay. We had jumped to that. I want to talk about...
hold on to that for a second.
I want to
go back to
exactly, because I have a feeling you're getting initial ickiness.
No, not getting ickiness. No, not at all. Okay. So the reverse racism.
Yeah. Reverse discrimination.
Those to me now, it's interesting hearing the way you're defining it, are two different things.
Yeah.
And you're right. I think often I'm confusing those as the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is really dangerous, isn't it?
Yes.
And this is why our language has to be
Clear.
So
Yes.
explicit. So anyways, okay, reverse racism. And I agree with you. I think, especially in the language of power,
Yeah.
especially in the language of power, in the United States, white culture is the power culture.
Yeah.
It is the power culture. And whether you want to agree with it or not, it is the power culture.
Yeah.
Especially as a whole system. It's a colonial mindset. It is power.
Yeah.
So therefore, if based on your definition, there cannot be reversed racism.
Correct.
Because a Black person can't be racist against a white person.
No.
Because predominantly white people have held power.
Yeah, because and racism is a combination of discrimination and power.
Power. Okay.
And power dynamic.
Got it. Okay, so that to me feels really comfortable and very, like, I like to put things on the shelf or a box, and that feels comfortable. Your discrimination, though, is interesting because I'm a really big proponent on Title IX. I'm a big Title VIII. Is that different than Title IX?
It's Title VII, which I thought. So Title IX, I think, is around female and so Title VII, I think, has to do within the workplace discrimination.
In the workplace discrimination.
And so specifically.
So in this,
because Title IX is around gender, and
in this context, what it's saying is we no longer have to prove that we're being discriminated against. We can just claim it. Is that what you're saying?
So what my understanding is, what this kind of reversed is initially Title VII was protecting of minority rights. So whether it be minority gender, minority
and did it explicitly
sexuality,
say minority?
Well, I didn't explicitly say, but there was a clause that in order to prove discrimination with Title VII and you're in a majority, you had to have like 4 contextual backgrounds to prove discrimination.
Sure.
So it couldn't just be so basically what it was kind of doing, again, it was kind of supporting DEI in a sense of it couldn't be a white man complains he's being discriminated because a Black man gets a promotion.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well,
so they needed.
But the thing is,
so that white man needed 4 other proofs of discrimination within that to prove that actual promotion,
that it could have been ageism, that it could have been it could have been religion,
was truly discrimination against him, and it wasn't just for the basis of this man was more qualified, or that kind of thing.
And it's really unfortunate because those safeguards, like what I hear you saying, is that discrimination can happen in a lot of different ways, and it's almost a little subtle too, when we think about it, or not little subtle.
So the argument in this case, what happened is, it was a white woman who her boss is gay, and she, up until then, supposedly had all raving reviews. She didn't get a promotion. Instead, they hired someone else out who was also gay, and then she got demoted. And so now she's claiming that there is discrimination and hierarchy against her sexuality for being straight. And in the past, she would have needed additional contextual information to prove this is full discrimination. And now what the court is saying is, no, everyone should be able to be freely, like everyone should
be able to give your opinion.
Yes, everyone should have the protection against discrimination under Title VII is what they're saying now. And so then this is, so I saw that. And so this is where like the zero-sum game and all of this kind of starts to come into play is, so I started kind of understanding some research around like when the types of like discrimination or again, reverse racism comes up, like where do these feelings help? Where do these ideas kind of get held? Because I do think there is still this often belief, whether we want to admit it or not, but there are plenty of people have some inklings within their office environment of feeling like, oh my gosh, I have less opportunity now because, all this in the past DEI stuff was happening. And so I talk about the zero-sum game is because this is often the mindset that creates that. Like it creates it with DEI is, oh my gosh, like the more people hear, they've done studies to say that both men, when it comes to feminism, that they have done studies that like when men start to hear about women's success in the workforce, then they start to systematically vote more against women's rights.
Yeah.
And they've said the same thing about white people when they hear more about the accomplishments of people of color. They systematically start to vote against people of colors because it's a zero-sum mindset. It's a sum.
Yeah, define the zero-sum mindset.
So the zero-sum mindset is the idea that we have a pie as society. And so we, like all of our economy or all of our jobs or everything are just in this limited possibility of a pie. And so therefore, if more people are uplifting and getting accomplishments, they're taking more of the pie. And then there's less of the pie for other people. And this is very, very common when it comes to, especially around feminism, is most men see life as a power struggle. And so if the more power we give women means the less power for them. And what ultimately feminism is trying to say is, no, it's more power for everyone.
Everybody.
It's not a zero-sum game, it's everyone. And so they've seen...
So I see what you're saying, how each of these things can actually lead to the perpetuating of this zero-sum game.
Yes. And so what's interesting about the zero-sum game, too, so I pulled some facts, is they've actually... economists have actually tied that 40% of U.S. growth since 1960 is attributed to the allocation across people of color and women. So like to better a talent allocation. So like our growth in economy, our growth in jobs and structures is due to the fact that we let women and people of color into the workforce. 40% of that economy growth is tied directly to that. Isn't that fascinating?
Can I go a little bit deeper in a different way than the statistics of growth? So why is it that we think this way? Right? Because the challenge is, what you're really talking about is a perpetual mindset.
Yes.
And so why are we doing this to one another? I had a situation in one of the demonstrations where someone was really frustrated with the immigrant population as if they were taking our jobs away.
Great example.
And your statistic, and even my personal experience as a professor over the years, there are so many more people and so much more need for people to serve and people to work and people to do that we actually don't have less jobs.
No.
We have a need for more jobs.
Yes.
It's like the perpetual, energy that starts. So why is it that we keep having that zero-sum game?
So this is not
human nature? Is this something that we keep reinforcing with one another? Is it capital?
Well, I think it's a combination. It's definitely the core of capitalism, the scarcity mindset, colonialism. We talked about they're taking over all of this. But I heard this very interesting take the other day on TikTok. So this is not factual, anyone. This is opinion-based take that I thought was really interesting around, especially where a lot of this white man crisis, there's this identity of this white man crisis, and a lot of that scarcity mindset, though white women, yes, but sticks within that white man crisis. And it's because they were saying for years, for centuries, we based, and especially after the Industrial Revolution, we based the power of men to be based on their strength. So men were taught that the stronger you were, you could have, because you could work on the factory floor, you could do building jobs, your value was within your strength. And therefore, physical strength.
Okay.
And therefore, they had this in value that at those times, if you look at Industrial Revolution, the boom of stuff is you could have a husband care for his entire family, insurance, everything, good salary on that factory job. And it was based on his strength. And then what started happening is the shift in what they call creative jobs. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
jobs that lean more towards the feminine. And I'm not saying women, but they lean towards feminine because they're analytical. They're outside the box thinking there, which tends to be a little bit more feminine things. And so these men for years who were taught that their value is within their strength and their power. And now we're moving to a society in tech that's these softer sized skills is where a lot of these men's, if you look at a lot of the jobs that they're talking about losing, it's those power strength jobs.
Yeah.
It's not this.
Which they want those anyways?
Well, but this is the common point of all of that. And so I might be kind of like, I'm not doing a good service to this creator and how they framed it, but it's an interesting mindset. It's just a mindset shift.
Yeah.
How things have shifted with the workforce. But because a lot of these people still see it as a sense of power, whereas like a creative industry is an abundance industry.
Yeah.
Whereas the power industry is a zero-sum game. Like you have a product, you have a this. And so it's a limited game in that sense. You're limited by your strength, your power in that versus the abundance of creativity. And so I think because still that mindset hasn't been shifted in a lot of people is why we still have those philosophies.
Well, it goes back to the patriarchal values, doesn't it? Because what we can't do, what we need to do is we need to get a group of people together and we need to imagine and to dream. I'm reading that book, Serviceberry, which is wonderful because it's about what you're talking about. It's like, nature is constantly regrowing itself. Like you can't put one flower in, like look at the dahlia tubers. You get more and more and they double and they double. If they're handled well and they're healthy, things double. Right? There isn't a zero end game unless you strip the environment.
Yep.
And so what we need to do is we need to get people together to rethink this, because it goes back to that colonial mindset of scarcity, right?
Yeah.
Of this scarcity. If we, it's really fascinating. I remember, and this isn't really zero-sum game, but it's a different way of thinking and a different way of managing. I mean, this is my ignorance, right? My generation. I'm in my 60s now. I remember being part of a system. It was within the church, and we lost our main pastor.
Yeah,
and so it was a challenge at the time. This was within the youth group. It was a challenge at the time because 3 people were able to sustain that space while in the interim, while we were looking for this youth pastor. And I had a really hard time. And this was like maybe 20 years ago. I had a really hard time with it because I kept saying, we need one person because that one person will help us be accountable, not 3 people. We don't need 3 people managing it because no one will be accountable. Man, did I learn how wrong I was.
Yeah.
Because these 3 people were able to take their strengths and they had to communicate. They had to do a really good job of sharing dialogue, but they each built on their strengths and they created a really great system of management. Well, of course, it doesn't last. Of course, like America, we always go back to our old ways of doing things. And so it's what you're talking about. It's like an imagination of change.
Of abundance. And they've done studies definitely to show that when you add more diverse perspectives in the workforce, you tend to grow as a team and not shrink as a team.
Yeah.
And now all of this is still...
But yet we don't keep doing it. So why don't we do that?
So this is what I was going to say. So I think because, again... there's 2 different conversations that continually have with people. You have the large set community-based conversations like we're having right now of this is effective for the community. This overall is helpful for the community. And yet there are still individual impacts. And this is what a lot of people are fearing, because you can say all you want to people about like, oh, you didn't get the job because it's better for the community that this person got the job. But that's still an impact to the individual, that they didn't get the job. And so it kind of was going back to my reflection earlier too about like, how do we tell someone vote for the community if they feel it's voting against their interest? And so I think this is where a lot of this kind of like these conversations have started to kind of spark up around people when they feel discrimination in the workplace because of DEI or things of that matter. And it's really hard to address that topic as an individual topic. When I think what we're trying, and so I used to struggle with this a lot when people would kind of have both those things. And now what I'm reflecting on is it's the work that we're doing now. It's all of it. All of it helps you untangle your individualist kind of drive and tie to that instance, if that makes sense, of not getting the job kind of thing. Like, it's your individualist fear. And if you do the work and you start to learn and educate, I don't know. But then it's so tricky, because I know I can hear people out there being like, yeah, but that doesn't put food on a table. But I think
it's a yes and a yes, right? I think it's a yes and a yes. I think, like, I look back in our histories, and I think that, you know, when we were centering on the language, when white people were colorblind, okay, there was I'm still going to be nice to my neighbor. I'm still going to respect my neighbor. That's the positive aspect of it.
Yeah.
And if my neighbor's hungry, I'm going to give my neighbor some food.
Yeah.
And so that's the positive what they weren't doing is saying, and yet we're putting our normal standards on you. We're telling you you're not working. We're not providing your jobs. So there's all that other stuff. But I do think, you know, this is why we're confused, because there's this level of helping each other out and being part of our community.
Yeah.
And yet the community that we were just thinking about was only white normal standards.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm hearing you say is, zero-sum game is a way in which we think.
Yeah.
Can we reevaluate that kind of thinking?
I would change that slightly. I think the zero-sum game is the way that our country teaches us to think.
Yes.
I'm not saying everyone thinks that way. It's the way that we are taught to think is a zero-sum game. How do we adjust that thinking?
And can we bring in, well, I think I was listening to this thing about someone talking about themselves, an Indigenous person saying, I'm a storyteller, because that is part of who their past. And I was thinking, that is being a storyteller, being someone that tells stories, allows for diverse points of view.
Yes.
And helps us learn different things. And so I do think, you know, as we unpack into how, like, the positive of individuality, which is accountability, which is working hard, and the negative, which is apathy and letting ourselves off the hook, not hearing other people's stories, the zero-sum game, it might make us a little polite because there's only this much chicken for the dinner. And yet it also it limits us, because we think, no, I'm just thinking about in terms of why did we get there? But then it also limits us because we're also not creative in the way that we can expand. It's like the loaves of fishes and so
And
forth.
I think this is kind of the point that I was trying to make a few minutes ago, is like, we can speak all of these general high level, like, great for community philosophies. The facts are still there, but like really separating yourself outside of this mentality is much harder than I know we're saying, because the day-to-day, if you are struggling with anything in your life, if you are struggling with lack of relationships, lack of finances, lack of security, it really is hard to step outside of an individualistic. So I understand even this conversation comes from a privileged perspective.
But I just had a thought. One of the things that we're trying to say is to actually talk.
Yeah.
So do you can we not fix it? I'll never forget one time we were going through a really difficult time financially, and I decided I'm going to tell my small group this, right? And a woman, a well-intentioned white woman, tried to get me into Amway. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't want to do that. And so let's try to be vulnerable. Let's try to tell people what our needs are. And the way that we can counteract that is to actually respond with
shame-free.
Well, or actually respond by listening.
Yeah.
Respond by maybe stepping in, maybe bringing a friend a meal. I don't know what that is, or can we be bigger listening to a policymaker and reading those policies so that we can make real change?
I think the takeaway that I want to have
so we need to be authentic to tell what we need, and we also need to change that model of scarcity.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So this episode might have been a little all over the place for people, but I think my takeaway is again, we've talked about this before, be aware of the small things that are happening in the court system right now. This is a case that just happened just a couple weeks ago that I think is going to have big ramifications on, and not just race, but white women, we're talking to you out there. This is big ramifications against what this might look like for discrimination against women too, and opportunities for women.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my first takeaway. I think the second takeaway is, if you have ever walked away from a situation feeling like you're discriminated against because you're a white woman, or you're discriminated against because you're white, I think this is also a time of reflection on where your zero-sum game comes from.
Yeah.
And where your scarcity mindset comes from, kind of thing. And then to your point, I do think talking it out is really good. This is why, why I say it without shame, is because we also do want amongst your friends to come to you and be like, oh my God, I feel really guilty. I saw this and my first thought was oh God, of course now another person against a white woman, something of those sorts.
Yeah.
And so when we want friends to come to the table to talk it through and talk through these conversations and not feel that they had shame around that initial thought kind of thing. And stuff. Yes, we all have thoughts that we might feel shame-based about, but talk it through with people and talk it through. And
find an accountability group. Call us. We'll be your accountability group.
We will.
But there's a couple things that as you were talking, and we'll wrap this up. But a couple things. First of all, I love that you unpacked reverse racism. As a white person, someone can't be racist against us.
No.
So let that go. Just let it go.
Yeah.
But I also liked the fact, okay, if the government is not going to have those 4 factual parts of discrimination anymore in the law, how do we still own that? So if I'm feeling discriminated against, are there 4 things? Not just race. Is it religion? Is it sexual orientation?
So
is it these other?
That's not what it was. It was 4 examples. It was 4 contextual examples of other times that this might have played towards the discrimination.
Just the one thing.
No.
So I guess
continual proof that this person or this system was a discriminatory system and not just a one-time promotion of a qualified person.
We're going to call it the rule of 4.
I love it.
So instead of just being one time, because we all get mad, we all get upset. I've had someone use ageism against me, but it was only once. It was truly only once. And that wasn't their intention, I could tell. So to prove that would be difficult. So maybe the other way of looking at this is it happening more often? And can we look for 4 contextual spaces?
Yeah. On that note, it is interesting. So again, white people, if we are feeling discriminated against, they did a survey last year. And when white people were asked if they have ever experienced discrimination, 13% said yes. When people of color answered, over 90% in every person of color demographic said yes.
Yeah.
So I think these are things also to start recognizing within that too. We might feel it individually in a circumstance, but overall, we got to wake up a little bit. It's big and see where we're complicit in this.
Yeah.
Where do you have a scarcity mindset? Where can you be abundant?
Wow.
Anyways,
Janelle,
this was
thank
great.
you. Thank you for joining us on White Women Wake Up. We hope today's conversation sparks something in you, whether it's reflection, a new question, a deeper commitment to showing up with empathy and accountability. If you found this episode meaningful, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can also connect with us on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, or at whitewomenwakeup.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going.
Yes.
Until next time, stay curious, be open, and let's keep waking up together.
Bye.
Thank you, Janelle. Okay, I'm recording now.
We'll get all these cords away.
Yeah, I know last week. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, do you got it? It was like a